Hello and welcome to E233. I'm your instructor, Gregory Myers. In this video, we're going to take an introductory look at debugging, specifically why you would want to debug, and also how to do debugging in the NetBeans environment using the MinGW compiler. So to begin with, the first thing that you want to do is obtain a copy of our debug_driver.c snips. And you want to go ahead and create a new project called Debug Demo. This video is part of a larger series of videos that's going to focus on debugging. And essentially, this is going to be a catch-all project where we end up taking cool debugging problems from other projects and then bring them into this project to maybe explore them a little further. So to begin with, what we want to do is we want to verify that our NetBeans environment is set up for both the C compiler but also for debugging. And essentially, these properties or these settings will be for all of our projects. So to begin with, we want to go to Tools, Options, and under the C and C++ tab, you want to make sure that you have not only the GCC compiler set up, but also that you have the GDB debugger command set up. Now, don't worry if your paths are different than mine. In this case, I simply installed MinGW into my software directory, but as long as you have these fields populated, that's the important part. At this point, then you can hit OK because we have the settings set up correctly for our NetBeans environment. The next step then is for each project that you intend to debug, you also have to make project level settings. And the simplest one, or the first one that we always need to make sure and make, is under the properties for the project. You go under the run branch, and you'll see that for the console type, you have a couple of different options. We are going to be interested in the external terminal. And so we always have to make sure to change the console type to external terminal, because otherwise we'll have to download another set of tools to be able to use the internal terminal. So at this point, we can just simply hit apply and OK. And please note that you have to do this for every project individually. So remember, once again, you simply right-click on the node, on the project node, you go to Properties, Run, and you set the console type to external terminal. We'll also see in a later video how we would handle command line arguments as well as files. But once again, we'll handle that in a later video. At this point, hit Apply and hit OK, and we should be set to go. So let's take a quick look at our debug driver, as this is the setup video for this demo. This has some code already in it. Particularly, I provided you with the function prototypes for not only your help, but also the setup NetBeans. And in our main, I provided you with a for loop that simply loops through all of the arguments provided at the command line. We've seen this pattern in several other projects. And in addition, I have provided you with an if structure to start helping us triage our command line switches. The big difference in this particular example is that I have commented out the initial implicit call for help and replaced it with a call to our demo, our setup NetBeans function. You'll see why in another video, but essentially what we're going to do is whenever we call our executable, without any command line arguments, we simply want to make a call to this demo function. Ultimately, we'll end up moving this in a later video. So let's get started on the purpose then of our function and ultimately the purpose behind debugging. So debugging is essentially a process by which you can look at your executable while it is in the process of executing. In other words, while your application is running, you can do things like look at the memory, look at the values of a particular variable, look at the locations of that variable. You can also follow things like the indexing inside of a loop and so on while the application is running. Now, one approach to doing this is to simply insert a bunch of printf statements in your code very liberally. However, this has some significant limitations and should be used as a backup, not as your primary plan for debugging your application. The second comment is, why debugging? In other words, what problems are we going to discover? Well, we will not discover syntax errors because those are going to be caught when you attempt to compile your project. But rather what we will be catching with debugging is going to be runtime or logic errors. Those are the types of errors that you may not necessarily catch when you bench test or essentially look over your code by hand. So the idea is things like indexing, maybe where you have an incorrect index value where you've stepped one value past the end of the array, or maybe passed a value by address when you didn't intend to, or variable by address when you didn't intend to. Those types of problems aren't going to be caught when you compile your project. They will only be seen when you run your executable. So the whole purpose behind debugging is another tool in your tool case for fixing your application when there is a problem. So to begin with, let's take a look at this little setup NetBeans function inside of our project. And the idea here is I simply want to collect some information from the user, and we're going to keep this one fairly straightforward. We're going to essentially collect 3 pieces of information from the user, 3 positive values from the user, and we're simply going to store it in an array. And what we want to do is we want to see the addresses of the various variables, as well as the array being populated each time we prompt the user for a value. In addition, we're going to put an arbitrary limitation on this that the user can only enter in positive values. This will allow for us to sort of understand the benefits of tracking the execution of our code. And so to begin with, what I want to do is I want to create some variables for our function here. I'm going to have one that I'm going to call values with an S, and we're simply going to make that a 3-element array. So 3-element array of integers. I'm also going to have a single value, and that is going to be used as a temporary variable to collect the information from the user, and it will also allow for us to validate the data before inserting it into the array. The only other temporary variable that I want to have is an index variable, and that keeps track of the current index, or in other words, which value we have collected from the user. So at this point then, we're going to simply have a while loop that continues to run while our index is less than 3. And once again, that 3 is an arbitrary value. It's just to keep this demo reasonably short. And in order for this to work, what we want to do then is initialize our index to 0. We could go ahead and initialize our value to 0, but that's part of the point of this demo, is that we see what those initial values are. Essentially, those garbage values are when we declare a variable, but we have not yet initialized it. Likewise, with the values array, we could go ahead and pre-initialize it. However, we want to actually explore this a little bit to see what those initial values are and sort of understand really what's going on behind the scenes. And the debugger allows us a great opportunity to do so. So what we want to do now is we simply want to prompt the user to please enter in a positive integer. Followed by a new line, and we're going to use a scanf with a %d, and we're going to store that value at the address of the value variable. At this point, we want to do some very cursory validation. In other words, we want to check to make sure the user did, in fact, enter in a positive integer. And so what we can do is we can essentially ask the question, is value less than or equal to 0? And if it is less than or equal to 0, we can supply the user with a warning, please pay attention, or something like, please enter a positive value. You entered And at this point, a %d and a new line, and we provide back to them the value that they entered. Now, once again, I don't encourage you to be too harsh with your user, but you do want to point out to them that they have entered in an incorrect value, however you wish to do that. And then under the else, then we assume we have done all of our validation. And then at this point, then we can insert the value into the array. Well, to do that, we simply say values, square brackets, index equal to whatever that value is. And then the last step, and the important step to avoid an infinite running while loop, would be to increment our index. And at this point, we are essentially done with our little application here. So at this point, what I'd like to do is, even before we debug it, I want to build it and come out to the command line and go to our debug demo. And I'm going to cd then to the dist debug mid-gw folder, and there is our debug demo. And go ahead and run this real quick, no switches, and it immediately jumps straight into entering in a positive integer. Because remember, in our main, we did not handle the scenario, or rather we handled the scenario, chose to handle the scenario where no arguments are passed by simply making a call to our setup NetBeans function. At this point then, we'll just briefly go through this so that you understand what this application is supposed to do. So we'll enter in, first we'll enter in a incorrect value, -1. 0 gets us a warning, and then 1, 2, and then 3, and then we're done. So we've got a few minor improvements we can make here to make this a little more user-friendly. One of the minor things I would like to do then is please enter in a positive integer for index equal to %d. In other words, that way the user can know exactly which value they are entering in the array, or the position of the value in the array. In this case, then what we'll do is we'll simply, once again, leverage this index variable. And at this point, then our application is a little more user-friendly. The other thing that we probably should consider doing is printing out the entire array once we're done. And to do that, we can once again leverage a loop by simply saying for index equals to 0, index less than 3. Once again, that's just arbitrary, and in this case, it's hard-coded. Index plus plus. And at this point, then we'll just have a nice little print statement that prints out the value, the values rather, square brackets with a %d, and that %d will be the index, and then another %d for the value, followed by a new line. And for that first placeholder, you simply use the index variable, and for that second placeholder, it's going to be values, square brackets, index. Now, with two loops, particularly one while loop and one for loop, we should now have plenty of opportunity to see the behavior of our debugger. So once again, go ahead and build it. Make sure that you have useful code. We're going to test this from the command line. Okay, so now you'll see that we're actually getting prompted, this time specifying the index. We'll put in 1, 2, and then 100, and you'll see there are my 3 values. So our application works, but that's not the point of debugging. In other words, what we want to do is we want to see under the hood, if you would. We want to look in to see exactly how our application works. So the necessity for compiling it before testing the debugger, there is no necessity, rather, for compiling it before testing the debugger. If your code won't compile, then you can't debug. So essentially what we want to do is make sure that our code is free of syntax errors before we get started. Now, to set up the debugger, what I'd like to do is I'd like to go up to my main, and I would simply like to select one of my line numbers. And particularly what I'll do is I'll start off with line 33. In this case, that's the first line of executable C code. In other words, on a, if we come up here to our declaration, then we aren't actually doing any execution here. We can leave the breakpoint up here. That's perfectly fine. And you'll see what happens in just a second. At this point, then what we'd like to do is we'd like to right click on our debug demo and simply select debug. And you can also do so in the top menu as well. But you'll see that the first step that our NetBeans environment did very quickly was that it compiled. I have now lost it here. It actually, oh, there it is. It's actually went ahead and built our project. Okay, so it's important that you have error-free code or syntax error-free code. Now, if you'll notice here, that first breakpoint, that was where I declared my index variable, was simply skipped over. So essentially, it's going to go to the first line of executable code where a breakpoint exists. So in this case, there is my breakpoint on line 33. You should now see a green arrow over the red square. This extra window should have just popped up. That is your external terminal that we set in the NetBeans in the project properties. And what I'm going to do now is, so we can understand what's going on, is I'm going to split my screen between the external terminal and the NetBeans environment. Now, you should have also seen some additional buttons pop up here, particularly this continue, as well as these 4 arrows. Now, we're going to be using several of these, particularly our continue and our step into. But what we'd like to do first is to start off with our step in. Our step into simply allows for us to step line by line through our code, going into any functions that may be called. And so, for instance, if we step, you'll see now that the green arrow has progressed to line 34. We step again, it steps into our for loop. You should also see this expression evaluation window here. And if you do not, you can simply go up to Windows, go to Debugging, and go to the expression evaluation. And at this point, then you can see you have a variables tab, and we're going to put the expression evaluation next to it because we'll need both of these, as well as a call stack. We'll see how this works in a little bit as well. We're going to focus mainly on this variable and this expression evaluation. And what you can see here is that as I'm stepping through my code, I am going to get access to the variables within main in this particular example. So if I step again, you'll see that I've jumped back out of the for loop. I've also printed over in the console the output of the printf. We step again. We only had rather one argument, so we only looped through the for loop once. If we step again, we'll now on line 39. If we step, we don't step over that function. Remember, we step into that function, which now takes us to our function and the next executable line of code. In other words, not our function declarations, but rather the first line of usable code. Once again, we should have the green arrow here. We step again. You'll see now I'm about to jump into my inner while loop. Before we do that, though, what I want to see is how we can access these individual variables. So just like the variables in main, you'll see now you can also see the variables inside of your function. And at this point, you can see the values of our declared but uninitialized array. So there's our values array. And you can see there's our 3 values right there. And right now, essentially, the values are garbage, as well as the value in the individual value variable, because we did not, in fact, initialize it. So we declared it, but we didn't initialize it. But if you'll notice, though, our index, we did initialize to 0. So its value then is set. But if we step one more time, we not only get the print statement in the console, we can step once more, and we are prompted then utilizing the scanf for the value. In this case, I'm just going to put in 123 for the first value. And if as soon as I hit enter, the focus returns back to NetBeans, and we are now on line 73. And you'll see that the value that I typed in at the console is now in my variables window. Now, we can continue this. You'll see that 123 is in fact greater than 0, so we shouldn't have any problems there. And we will now update then the first element in our array. And then if we step again, we increment our index from 0 to 1. We can repeat this again. Notice how my value is still 123. We haven't changed it. We haven't reinitialized our value variable. Still got the previous value in it. So at this point, then what we have to do is we have to enter in something different over in the console. Control is returned back to NetBeans. I step. 234 is, of course, greater than 0. So we're going to put that in as the second value in the array. And then for the third iteration, then we're going to do this a little bit differently here, in that we're going to go ahead and collect the value. I'll put in 345 here. But what I'd like to do is, instead of leveraging the variables window, I'd like to come over to the expression evaluation, and I can do things like type in value. I'll see the value. I can also type in whether or not it is greater than 0. You'll see that that returns 1, or essentially true. I can also access individual elements in my values array, as well as the third element, which is still garbage. And I can also access the entire array, but we can also do one other thing that we can't do through our variables window here. And that is, we can also access the address. So in other words, if you want to know the address of the value variable, you simply put the ampersand in front of it, and you'll see that the address is this hexadecimal value. Also, you can get the address of the entire array, or the values array, and you will get this hexadecimal address. You can also do things like get the address of the index variable. And you can see here that this is all roughly clustered in the same memory area. Now, continuing on with debugging, let's say that you are fine with what you've done so far. You're happy, there's no errors, at least none that you immediately pick up on. You can put an additional breakpoint, for instance, down here in our for loop. And at this point, then you can simply hit continue, and continue will jump to the next breakpoint. And so it basically, instead of stepping through each line of code, it simply looks for the next breakpoint, executes all of the code between the previous point that you've stopped and the next breakpoint, and then once again stops. At this point, you can iterate through the for loop one step at a time. And you'll see over in my console how I am printing out one value at a time. And then you'll see that the green arrow goes to the last curly brace. And this would be where we would have a return value if our function did not have a void. And then we step once again, and it returns control back to the main. Now, in this particular case, it jumped over a lot of other code, because in this particular case, our if statement is set up such that if argc was less than 2, it caught, or we fell into this branch of the if statement, and it ran this particular function. When it returned from this function, there was no more code to run in this branch of the if statement. So it jumped out of the if statement, and then the next usable line of code to run, or the next executable line of code, was simply the return from our main, in which case if we step again, you'll see that we are at the end of our main. And at this point, we are done debugging. And at this point, you can either hit finish debugging, or if you hit the down arrow one more time, the console closes. So this is meant as an introductory video for debugging. This is by far not the only video for debugging we are going to do. So if anything, what you want to do is continue to watch this series. But just to recap the importance of debugging, it is a tool to be able to identify runtime and logic errors. It does not help us necessarily with syntax errors. Secondly, it is meant as one in a series of tools in your toolbox or in your toolkit, another one of which is a liberal use of the printf statements to allow for us to see the output on the console, essentially make your executable a little bit noisy. It is, however, not a replacement for the printf, and nor is the printf a replacement for debugging. You kind of want to use those two hand in hand. So you're gonna discover that debugging is a little bit of a science and a little bit of an art form. Now, the last piece of advice that I'm going to give you on debugging is that whenever you have an error in your code that you are attempting to debug, go to the line where you think that error is and essentially put the breakpoint on that line or before it. Remember that in many cases, your code is running sequentially. So if you can stop the debugger or put a breakpoint in at a point before you see the error, you can essentially step by step through the code that leads up to the error. And then the last thing I want to do is just simply remind you that you have to do the properties setup for each one of your projects. So in this case, you want to go to the run and change our external terminal, change our console type to external terminal. At this point, I hope you found this video useful. As always, if you have any questions or comments, don't hesitate to email me, and thank you for watching.